Good evening, and welcome to a story that makes every Hollywood war movie look like a children's bedtime story. Picture this. It's the early 1800s, and across Europe, the sound of cannon fire has become as common as church bells. Kings are fleeing their palaces in the middle of the night. Entire armies are disappearing into the Russian winter, and at the center of it all stands a man, barely 5'7", who somehow convinced himself that the entire continent needed his personal attention. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican nobody who clawed his way from artillery officer to emperor of the French, and then spent the next 2 decades proving that some people simply cannot sit still. Tonight, we're diving deep into the mind of history's most compulsive warmonger, a man who treated Europe like his personal chessboard and human lives like pawns to be sacrificed for his grand vision. We'll explore his meteoric rise from obscurity, his genius on the battlefield that left seasoned generals weeping into their brandy, and his seemingly pathological inability to enjoy a peaceful afternoon without plotting to invade someone. This is a tale of brilliant military strategy mixed with catastrophic overreach, of a man who could win a dozen battles in a row and then throw it all away because he heard there was a country somewhere that hadn't bowed to him yet. By the time we're done here, you'll understand how one man's refusal to take a vacation reshaped the entire map of Europe, cost millions of lives, and ultimately destroyed the very empire he built with his own blood-stained hands. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who couldn't stop fighting, even when fighting meant losing everything he'd ever won. But before we march into battle, do me a favor and drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching this from, and whether your current location feels more like a cozy living room or the frozen wasteland of the Russian retreat at 2 a.m. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because unlike Napoleon, you don't need to conquer half of Europe just to feel like you've accomplished something today. To understand how Napoleon became Europe's most feared and relentless warlord, we need to go back to where it all began, the island of Corsica in 1769, where a baby was born who would grow up to make Alexander the Great look like a weekend warrior. Corsica had recently been sold by the Genoese to the French, a transaction that Napoleon's father, Charles Bonaparte, viewed as an opportunity to kiss up to his new French overlord. Young Napoleon, however, would spend his childhood nursing a grudge against France that would later mutate into an obsession with dominating. The Bonaparte family occupied that uncomfortable middle ground between nobility and obscurity that produces either great ambition or great bitterness, and in Napoleon's case, it produced both. His father Charles was a lawyer and minor noble who had initially supported Corsican independence under Pasquale Paoli, but quickly switched sides when French rule became inevitable. This pragmatic approach to loyalty would become a family trait, though Napoleon would later elevate it from mere opportunism to high art. Growing up in Ajaccio, Napoleon was surrounded by reminders that Corsica was a conquered territory, not a willing participant in the French Empire. The French garrison, the French officials, the French language imposed on Corsican schools all served as constant reminders that his homeland had been absorbed by a foreign power. Most children would have accepted this as simply the way things were. Napoleon internalized it as a personal challenge. If the French could conquer Corsica, then perhaps a Corsican could conquer France. Napoleon's early life reads like the origin story of a supervillain. He was sent to military school in mainland France at age 9, where he was relentlessly bullied for his Corsican accent and his family's modest means. The other students came from established French noble families with centuries of military tradition. Napoleon was the scholarship kid from the recently conquered island who spoke French with an accent thick enough to cut with a sword. While other children were playing with toy soldiers, Napoleon was studying the campaigns of Julius Caesar and Frederick the Great, apparently deciding that if he couldn't fit in with his classmates, he'd simply conquer them all later. The boy who couldn't pronounce French properly was already dreaming of making French the language of European surrender. The irony of Napoleon's education is that the French state was essentially training its own nemesis. The military academy system was designed to produce competent officers for the royal army, men who would serve the Bourbon monarchy with distinction and never question the established order. Instead, it produced Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who would overthrow that monarchy and replace it with something far more dangerous. A meritocracy based on the ability to organize violence more efficiently than your enemy. At the Royal Military Academy, Napoleon discovered his true calling, the art of blowing things up in strategically advantageous ways. He graduated as a second lieutenant in the artillery, and here's where the story gets interesting. Artillery in the 18th century wasn't just about having big guns, it was about mathematics, trajectory, timing, and the kind of cold calculation that treats human beings as variables in an equation. Napoleon didn't just excel at this, he fell in love with it. He saw warfare not as a tragic necessity, but as the ultimate intellectual puzzle, one where the stakes were high enough to make it worth his while. The choice of artillery as a specialty was revealing in ways that Napoleon probably didn't fully understand at the time. Infantry officers had to deal with soldiers as individuals, maintaining morale, managing personalities, and thinking about the human cost of their decisions. Cavalry officers developed romantic notions about honor and glory that sometimes interfered with practical military objectives, but artillery officers worked with machines and mathematics, treating battles as engineering problems to be solved through the proper application of force at the correct angle and velocity. It was perfect training for someone who would later treat entire nations as pieces on a chessboard. Napoleon's early military career coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in French history, and he demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time with exactly the skills that the situation demanded. When the revolution erupted in 1789, most army officers faced a terrible choice: remain loyal to the monarchy and risk execution, or support the revolution and betray their oaths. Napoleon, with the moral flexibility that would characterize his entire career, managed to avoid this dilemma by positioning himself as essential to whoever was currently winning. The young Napoleon was not particularly idealistic about revolutionary principles. His letters from the period show little interest in liberty, equality, or fraternity, and considerable interest in military strategy, personal advancement, and Corsican independence. He supported the revolution not because he believed in its ideals, but because the revolution offered opportunities for rapid promotion that would have been impossible under the old regime. The monarchy promoted based on birth and connections. The republic promoted based on competence and results. For someone with Napoleon's talents and ambitions, the revolution was less a political upheaval and more a career opportunity. But Napoleon's relationship with revolutionary ideology was more complex than simple opportunism. He genuinely admired the concept of careers open to talent, the idea that merit should matter more than birth. This wasn't because he was a Democrat at heart, but because he was confident that he had more talent than anyone else around him. The revolution promised that the most capable individuals would rise to positions of authority, and Napoleon was absolutely certain that he was the most capable individual in any room he entered. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and while most sensible people were trying to keep their heads attached to their necks, Napoleon saw opportunity. Political chaos meant rapid promotion for anyone competent enough to organize the systematic killing of the monarchy's enemies. Napoleon threw himself into revolutionary warfare with the enthusiasm of a man who had finally found his calling. He wasn't fighting for liberty, equality, or fraternity. He was fighting because he was really, really good at it, and the revolution gave him an excuse to do what he loved most: win battles. The Siege of Toulon in 1793 was Napoleon's coming-out party, the moment when he announced to the world that a new kind of military mind had emerged from the chaos of revolution. Toulon had been occupied by British and Spanish forces supporting the royalist cause, and the Republican army had been making a hash of trying to retake it. Napoleon, still just a captain of artillery, looked at the situation and saw what everyone else had missed. The key to Toulon wasn't the harbour or the city itself, but a single fort that controlled the harbour entrance. Take the fort, and the British fleet would have to withdraw. Without the fleet, the garrison would have to surrender. It was the kind of insight that seems obvious in retrospect, but required genuine military genius to recognize at the time. Napoleon didn't just identify the crucial target, he positioned his guns with mathematical precision, coordinated the assault with other units, and personally supervised the bombardment that made the British position untenable. When Toulon fell, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at age 24. Most people that age are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives. Napoleon had found his calling and was already revolutionizing. The promotion to general opened new possibilities for Napoleon, but it also introduced him to the peculiar challenges of revolutionary politics. The terror was in full swing, and military success was no guarantee of political survival. Napoleon watched as successful generals were guillotined for insufficient revolutionary fervor, while incompetent commanders survived because they knew how to navigate the political maze of revolutionary Paris. It was a lesson that Napoleon would never forget. Military talent without political acumen was worthless, but political skill without military backing was suicide. Napoleon's brief imprisonment during the Thermidorian reaction taught him another crucial lesson. Revolutionary governments were inherently unstable, and the only reliable source of power was the loyalty of armed men who had personal reasons to support you. He wasn't imprisoned for any crime against the Republic. He was imprisoned because his political patrons had fallen from favor. Military genius meant nothing if the people in charge decided you were politically unreliable. The experience left Napoleon with a permanent distrust of civilian authority and a conviction that the only safe position for a successful general was at the top of the political hierarchy. But it was in 1796 that Napoleon truly announced himself to the world as someone you definitely didn't want to mess with. Given command of the Army of Italy, he launched what would become known as the Italian Campaign, a masterclass in rapid warfare that left veteran Austrian and Sardinian generals wondering what the hell had just happened to them. In a series of battles that read like a greatest hits album of military genius, Napoleon defeated enemies who outnumbered him, outmaneuvered armies with decades more experience, and established his reputation as someone who could turn a hopeless situation into a crushing victory before lunch. The army of Italy that Napoleon inherited was in pathetic condition, poorly supplied, unpaid for months, demoralized by a series of defeats, and consisting largely of conscripts who would rather be anywhere else. Most generals would have spent months reorganizing, retraining, and re-equipping before attempting any serious military operations. Napoleon took one look at his ragtag force and decided to invade northern Italy immediately, apparently operating on the theory that if you're going to fail spectacularly, you might as well do it quickly. What happened next was either military genius or the most successful bluff in European history. Napoleon began the campaign with a proclamation to his troops that was part inspiration and part threat. Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. I am about to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. The message was clear. Follow me to victory and wealth, or starve in these mountains. It wasn't exactly liberty, equality, fraternity, but it was honest. The Battle of Montenotte on April 12, 1796, set the tone for the entire campaign. Faced with Austrian and Sardinian forces that outnumbered him significantly, Napoleon used speed and concentration of force to attack them before they could coordinate their movements. He defeated the Austrians at Montenotte, then turned around and smashed the Sardinians at Millesimo before either enemy force knew what the other was doing. Within a week, Napoleon had knocked Sardinia out of the war entirely, leaving the Austrians to face the French alone. What made Napoleon's tactics revolutionary wasn't just their effectiveness, but their complete departure from 18th century military orthodoxy. Traditional generals moved slowly, maintained their supply lines, and avoided battle unless they had overwhelming advantages. Napoleon moved so fast that he often arrived at battles before his enemies knew he was coming, lived off the land to avoid supply constraints, and sought out battles even when outnumbered because he was confident he could outfight anyone. The siege of Mantua became the centerpiece of the Italian campaign, a months-long struggle that demonstrated Napoleon's ability to combine tactical brilliance with strategic patience. Mantua was the key Austrian fortress in northern Italy, and as long as it remained in Austrian hands, Napoleon's conquest would remain precarious. But Mantua was also a trap. The Austrians couldn't abandon it without losing all hope of maintaining their position in Italy, which meant they would have to keep sending relief armies that Napoleon could destroy piecemeal. Over the course of 6 months, the Austrians sent 4 separate armies to relieve Mantua, and Napoleon defeated all 4 in battles that showcased different aspects of his military genius. At Castiglione, he demonstrated his ability to coordinate complex troop movement. At Arcole, he showed his talent for personal leadership under fire. At Rivoli, he proved that he could win battle with pure tactical brilliance, even when significantly outnumbered. Each Austrian defeat made the eventual fall of Mantua more inevitable. The Italian campaign wasn't just about military success, it was about establishing Napoleon's brand. He began writing his own propaganda, describing his victories in terms that made him sound less like a general and more like a force of nature. His soldiers weren't just winning battle, they were participating in something historic, something that would echo through the ages. Napoleon understood something that many military leaders miss. Wars aren't just won on battlefield. They're won in the stories people tell about those battles. Napoleon's treatment of conquered territories in Italy revealed both his political sophistication and his fundamental cynicism about revolutionary ideals. He established puppet republics with constitutions that promised liberty and equality, but he also systematically looted Italian art treasures to send back to Paris and imposed crushing financial tributes on the populations he had liberated. The Italian republics were free in name only. In practice, they were French colonies run for French benefit. The wealth that Napoleon extracted from Italy served multiple purposes. It funded his army, making him independent of the financially strapped Directory in Paris. It demonstrated his value to the French government, showing that conquest could be profitable as well as glorious. And it established his personal fortune, giving him the resources to pursue political ambitions back in France. Napoleon had discovered that successful generals could essentially become self-financing entrepreneurs, using conquest to fund more conquest in a virtuous cycle of military expansion. But perhaps most importantly, the Italian campaign established Napoleon's reputation as someone who could deliver the impossible. European warfare in the 18th century was typically indecisive, with campaigns dragging on for years and peace treaties that restored the status quo. Napoleon had conquered most of northern Italy in less than 2 years, destroyed multiple enemy armies, and forced Austria to sue for peace. He had proved that decisive victory was still possible in modern warfare, but only for commanders with sufficient skill and ruthlessness to pursue it. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 was Napoleon's first major diplomatic triumph, and it revealed his understanding that peace treaties were just intermissions between wars. He gave Austria compensation in the form of Venetian territory, eliminated the ancient Republic of Venice as an independent state, and established French hegemony over northern Italy. Most generals would have seen this as the successful completion of their mission, but Napoleon saw it as the foundation for even greater conquest. The Italian campaign had transformed Napoleon from a promising young general into a national hero, but it had also revealed the fundamental contradiction in his character that would eventually destroy him. He was genuinely brilliant at achieving military objectives, but he couldn't resist turning every military success into a stepping stone toward political power. The Directory had sent him to Italy to defeat Austria. He had defeated Austria, conquered territory, established puppet republics, and made himself rich and famous in the process. It was a level of overachievement that made his political masters nervous. By 1798, Napoleon had become so successful that the French Directory decided he needed a new challenge, preferably one that would take him very far away from Paris. They gave him an army and told him to go conquer Egypt, ostensibly to threaten British trade routes to India, but really because they were getting nervous about having someone that competent and ambitious hanging around the capital. Napoleon loved the idea. Egypt meant pyramids, exotic locations, and most importantly, a chance to compare himself to Alexander the Great, who had also conquered Egypt at a young age. The Egyptian campaign was Napoleon's first taste of imperial overreach, a preview of the character flaw that would eventually destroy him. Despite some tactical successes, the campaign was strategically pointless. The French fleet was destroyed by Admiral Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, leaving Napoleon's army stranded in the desert with no way home and no clear mission beyond looking impressive in front of ancient monuments. But Napoleon didn't see failure. He saw material for his legend. He commissioned scholars to document everything, turning a military disaster into a cultural expedition that would feed his growing mythology. Napoleon's approach to the Egyptian expedition revealed his growing detachment from reality and his increasing obsession with his own historical importance. He brought along a small army of scholars, scientists, and artists whose job was to study and document Egyptian civilization, supposedly for the advancement of human knowledge, but actually to associate Napoleon's name with one of history's greatest civilizations. The savants, as they were called, were essentially Napoleon's first spin doctors, tasked with creating an intellectual justification for what was basically a military adventure. The Battle of the Pyramids on July 21st, 1798, was vintage Napoleon. Outnumbered by Mamluk cavalry renowned for their fighting ability, he used superior discipline and firepower to achieve a crushing victory. His famous proclamation to his troops, "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you from these pyramids," was the kind of theatrical gesture that Napoleon would make throughout his career. He understood that battles weren't just about killing the enemy. They were about creating moments that would be remembered and repeated. But the Egyptian campaign also revealed Napoleon's growing indifference to the welfare of his own men. Cut off from France by British naval power, the Army of the Orient began suffering from disease, inadequate supplies, and the psychological strain of fighting in a foreign land with no clear purpose. Napoleon's response was to launch even more ambitious campaigns, marching his increasingly depleted forces into Syria in a doomed attempt to threaten British interests in the eastern Mediterranean. The Siege of Acre was Napoleon's first clear military, a humbling experience that should have taught him something at the limits of French power. Defended by a British officer named Sir Sidney Smith and supported by British naval guns, Acre withstood French assault for 2 months before Napoleon was forced to retreat. The failure at Acre didn't just cost Napoleon men and prestige, it demonstrated that British naval supremacy could make French land victories meaningless. Napoleon's decision to abandon his army in Egypt and return to France was the first of many occasions when he would sacrifice his subordinates for his personal advantage. Faced with political chaos in Paris and military stalemate in Egypt, Napoleon chose to cut his losses and position himself for the next phase of his career. He left his army under the command of Jean-Baptiste Kleber, with vague instructions to maintain French positions and await further orders that would never come. The journey back to France through British-controlled waters was a dangerous gamble that succeeded more through luck than planning. Napoleon's ship evaded British patrols and delivered him safely to the French coast, where he immediately began spinning the Egyptian expedition as a great success. The scholars had made important discoveries. French arms had triumphed over exotic enemies, and Napoleon had added another chapter to his growing legend. The fact that the expedition had achieved none of its strategic objectives was quietly ignored. Napoleon's return to France in October 1799 coincided with a political crisis that seemed tailor-made for his talents and ambitions. The Directory was weak, divided, and increasingly unpopular. Military defeats in Italy and Germany had erased many of the gains from Napoleon's earlier campaigns. The economy was struggling, and political stability seemed impossible to achieve. What France needed, according to Napoleon and his growing circle of supporters, was strong leadership from someone with proven military competence and the political skill to impose order on revolutionary chaos. When Napoleon abandoned his army in Egypt to rush back to France, he wasn't retreating, he was positioning himself for his next move. The Directory was weak, France was tired of revolutionary chaos, and Napoleon had exactly the combination of military credibility and political ambition needed to seize power. The coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799 was less a violent revolution and more a hostile corporate takeover, with Napoleon as the CEO, who had just bought out the competition. The conspiracy that brought Napoleon to power was remarkably well organized for something that was supposedly saving France from political chaos. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the directors, wanted to revise the constitution but needed military backing to overcome opposition. Joseph Fouché, the cunning police minister, wanted to align himself with whoever was going to win the inevitable power struggle. Talleyrand, the ultimate political survivor, saw Napoleon as the strong man who could finally stabilize the French government. Each conspirator thought they were using Napoleon for their own purpose. In fact, Napoleon was using all of them. The actual coup was almost anticlimactic. Napoleon's brother Lucien, serving as president of the Council of 500, helped orchestrate a series of parliamentary maneuvers that transferred power from the Directory to 3 consuls, with Napoleon as first consul. There were some tense moments when legislators threatened to declare Napoleon an outlaw, but the presence of armed soldiers in the meeting hall encouraged more cooperative behavior. Within hours, the Directory had been dissolved and replaced by the consulate, with Napoleon holding effective executive power. At 30 years old, Napoleon had gone from Corsican outsider to first consul of France. But here's the thing about Napoleon: achieving power never satisfied. Power was just the entry fee to play the game he really loved, the game of war. As first consul, he could have focused on rebuilding France, establishing peace, creating lasting institutions. Instead, he started planning his next campaign. Peace for Napoleon wasn't an end goal, it was just a timeout between battles. The transformation of Napoleon from successful general to head of state revealed new dimensions of his personality that would define the rest of his career. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to master complex administrative detail while simultaneously planning military campaigns on multiple fronts. He could spend hours reviewing budgets and legal codes in the morning, then switch to planning troop movements and artillery positions in the afternoon. It was the kind of intellectual versatility that made him uniquely dangerous as a political leader. Napoleon's early months as first consul demonstrated his understanding that political power in post-revolutionary France depended on delivering results rather than respecting traditions. He reorganized the government to concentrate decision-making authority in his hands, but he also made sure that the government actually functioned effectively. Roads were built, laws were codified, budgets were balanced, and the economy began recovering from years of revolutionary disruption. Napoleon proved that authoritarian efficiency could be more appealing to war-weary citizens than democratic chaos. But Napoleon's most important early decision as first consul was to continue the wars that the Directory had been fighting. The Second Coalition was still active, with Austria and Britain leading resistance to French expansion. A sensible leader might have sought peace negotiations to consolidate domestic reforms, but Napoleon saw the ongoing wars as opportunities to cement his political position through military glory. Victory in war would prove that the coup had been necessary and beneficial. Defeat would destroy his credibility and probably cost him his life. The political genius of Napoleon's position was that he had made himself indispensable to French national success. If France won its wars, Napoleon would get the credit for providing strong leadership. If France lost, the defeats would be blamed on his predecessors in the Directory, while his coup would be seen as an attempt to save the situation. It was a win-win political strategy that made military success highly desirable, but not absolutely necessary for political survival. Napoleon's transformation from ambitious general to unstoppable war machine began with his understanding of a simple truth. If you're going to fight constantly, you'd better be excellent at it. As first consul, he didn't just reorganize the French government. He turned the entire country into a military production facility designed to support his increasingly grandiose campaigns. France under Napoleon became less a nation and more a weapons manufacturer with delusions of grandeur. The Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church wasn't about spiritual reconciliation. It was about making sure priests would preach about the glory of dying for France. The Napoleonic Code wasn't just legal reform. It was a system designed to create citizens who understood their primary duty was to serve the state in whatever capacity Napoleon deemed necessary. Education was restructured to produce engineers, administrators, and officers. Everything, absolutely everything, was subordinated to the war machine. But Napoleon's true genius lay in revolutionizing warfare itself. While European armies were still fighting like it was 1700, Napoleon introduced concepts that wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century. He perfected the art of living off the land, allowing his armies to move faster than opponents who were bogged down by supply trains. He pioneered the use of combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and artillery in ways that turned battles into carefully orchestrated symphonies of destruction. Most importantly, Napoleon understood that modern warfare was about speed, momentum, and psychological impact. His enemies might have more soldiers, better positions, or superior resources, but they thought like generals from the previous century. They planned campaigns like chess matches, careful and methodical. Napoleon fought like he was playing speed chess, while his opponents were still reading the rules. By the time they figured out what he was doing, he'd already won. The War of the Second Coalition, 1799 to 1802, gave Napoleon his first chance to test his theories on a continental scale. Austria, Britain, and Russia had formed an alliance to contain French expansion, which was exactly the kind of challenge that made Napoleon's pulse quicken. Rather than defensive warfare, Napoleon chose to attack everywhere at once, keeping his enemies so busy responding to his moves that they never had time to coordinate their superior numbers. The Battle of Marengo in 1800 perfectly encapsulated Napoleon's approach to warfare. Caught off guard by Austrian forces, Napoleon's army was actually losing for most of the day. A conventional general might have retreated, regrouped, and tried again later. Napoleon saw opportunity in disaster. He held his position until reinforcements arrived, then launched a counterattack that turned near defeat into crushing victory. The Austrians went from confident victory to panicked retreat in a matter of hours. Napoleon had discovered something profound. Battles aren't over until he says they're over. But winning battles wasn't enough for Napoleon. He needed to win them in style. His victory bulletins were masterpieces of propaganda that made him sound less like a military commander and more like destiny personified. Soldiers, in 15 days you have won 6 victories, taken 21 standards, 55 pieces of artillery, several strong positions, and conquered the richest part of Piedmont, read one dispatch from Italy. Note the language, not we won, but you won, under his leadership. Napoleon was already crafting the narrative that his presence on a battlefield was itself a guarantee of victory. The Peace of Amiens in 1802 should have been Napoleon's chance to consolidate his gains, strengthen France, and maybe enjoy a quiet year or two of not having people actively trying to kill him. Instead, he used the peace to reorganize his armies, improve his logistics, and plan even more ambitious campaign. Peace for Napoleon was just war by other means, a chance to prepare for the next round of conquest. In 1804, Napoleon took the next logical step in his evolution from general to living legend. He crowned himself Emperor of the French. The coronation at Notre Dame was a masterpiece of political theatre, with Napoleon literally taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head. The message was clear. His authority came not from God, not from the people, not from tradition, but from his own will to power. He was emperor because he was strong enough to make himself emperor, and he would remain emperor as long as he could defend his position on the battlefield. But even becoming emperor wasn't enough to satisfy Napoleon's appetite for conquest. The Holy Roman Empire, that 1,000-year-old symbol of European stability, was still out there, still existing without his permission. The Third Coalition, 1805, brought together Austria, Russia, and Britain in another attempt to contain French expansion, and Napoleon's response was typically elegant. He would destroy them so completely that no one would ever question his authority again. The campaign of 1805 was Napoleon at his absolute peak, demonstrating the kind of strategic brilliance that made other generals weep with envy. Faced with Austrian and Russian armies converging on France, Napoleon didn't wait to be attacked. Instead, he marched his Grande Armée across Europe at a pace that left his enemies dizzy, surrounded an entire Austrian army at Ulm before they knew what was happening, and then turned to face the combined Austrian and Russian forces at Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on December 2nd, 1805, was Napoleon's masterpiece, the victory that established him as the greatest tactical genius of his generation. Outnumbered by the combined Austrian and Russian forces, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank to lure his enemies into a trap. When they attacked what they thought was his weak point, Napoleon struck back with concentrated force that shattered the entire coalition army. The Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, watched his empire die on that battlefield. Within months, the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 8 centuries, was dissolved. Napoleon wasn't just winning battle, he was reshaping the fundamental structure of European civilization. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced the Holy Roman Empire, with Napoleon as its protector. German princes who had ruled independently for centuries now took their orders from Paris. The map of Europe was being redrawn according to Napoleon's personal preferences, and anyone who objected could expect a visit from the Grande Armée. But here's where Napoleon's character flaw became apparent. Success made him hungrier, not satisfied. Each victory convinced him that even greater victories were possible. Austerlitz proved he could defeat emperors. Now he wanted to defeat kings, republic, empire, anyone who dared to exist without acknowledging his supremacy. The problem with being the greatest military genius of your generation is that it gives you the confidence to attempt things that even a military genius shouldn't attempt. After Austerlitz, Napoleon faced a problem that would have challenged any conqueror. How do you defeat an enemy you can't reach? Britain remained defiantly unconquered, protected by the Royal Navy and determined to bankroll every coalition that formed against France. Napoleon's solution was characteristically ambitious and completely insane. If he couldn't invade Britain, he would strangle it economically by cutting it off from European trade. This became known as the Continental System, and it was basically Napoleon's attempt to weaponize an entire continent's economy. The Continental System required every nation under French influence to cease trade with Britain, turning Europe into a giant economic fortress designed to starve Britain into submission. On paper, it was brilliant. Britain's economy depended on European markets, so cutting off trade would force British capitulation without requiring a single battle. In practice, it was the kind of overreach that turns military genius into imperial disaster. Napoleon's problem was that the Continental System required the cooperation of every major European power, whether they wanted to cooperate. Spain, Portugal, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Italy, the Netherlands, they all had to enforce French trade policy or face the consequences. This meant Napoleon wasn't just fighting Britain anymore, he was fighting human nature itself. People wanted British goods, merchants wanted British profits, and smugglers wanted British gold. Enforcing the Continental System required constant military pressure across an entire continent. The Peninsular War, 1807 to 1814, began because Portugal refused to close its ports to British trade. Napoleon's solution was to march an army through Spain to force Portuguese compliance, but the Spanish royal family's incompetence gave him an even more tempting opportunity. When the Spanish king abdicated in favor of Napoleon's brother Joseph, Napoleon thought he'd gained control of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Instead, he'd stumbled into the first modern guerrilla war, a conflict that would bleed French resources for 7 years and teach Europe that Napoleon's armies could be defeated. The Spanish didn't fight Napoleon's armies in conventional battles they couldn't win. They fought a war of ambush, assassination, and attrition that turned occupied Spain into a nightmare for French forces. Supply convoys were attacked, isolated garrisons were massacred, and French officials were murdered in their beds. Napoleon had encountered an enemy that couldn't be defeated by tactical brilliance, an entire population that refused to accept occupation. Meanwhile, the Fourth Coalition, 1806-1807, gave Napoleon another chance to demonstrate his battlefield genius against more conventional enemies. Prussia, convinced that Napoleon could be defeated by superior discipline and traditional tactics, learned otherwise at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. Napoleon's armies didn't just defeat the Prussians, they annihilated them so completely that the Prussian army essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. King Frederick William III fled to Russia, leaving Napoleon to occupy Berlin and dictate terms from the palace of Frederick the Great. But even crushing Prussia wasn't enough to end the war. Russia remained in the field, and Napoleon found himself campaigning in Poland against enemies who had learned not to fight him conventionally. The battles of Eylau and Friedland were French victories, but they were costly victories against enemies who were learning to adapt to Napoleon's method. The myth of French invincibility was beginning to crack. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 should have been Napoleon's greatest diplomatic triumph. Meeting with Tsar Alexander IV on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, Napoleon convinced the Russian emperor to join the continental system and divide European influence between France and Russia. On paper, Napoleon had achieved the impossible. He had turned his greatest enemy into his ally. In practice, he had created the conditions for his own destruction. The alliance with Russia was built on mutual self-interest, not trust, and the continental system put impossible strain on Russian interests. Russia's economy depended on trade with Britain, and forcing Russian compliance with French trade policy created resentment that would eventually explode into war. Napoleon had won a diplomatic victory that guaranteed future military conflict. By 1809, Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe, either directly or through puppet states. But controlling territory and governing it effectively are two very different things. The War of the Fifth Coalition brought Austria back into conflict with France, resulting in Napoleon's victory at Wagram, but even victory was becoming more difficult. Austrian resistance was better organized, and Napoleon's own forces were showing signs of strain from constant campaigning. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 was supposed to seal his integration into European royalty, but it also demonstrated how far he had traveled from his revolutionary origins. The man who had once proclaimed the end of monarchy was now desperate to join the club of European sovereigns. He had become the very thing he had once fought against, an absolute monarch whose power depended on military force and dynastic marriage. The cracks in Napoleon's empire were becoming visible to anyone who cared to look. The continental system was creating economic hardship across Europe without significantly damaging British trade. Nationalist movements were stirring in Germany and Italy. The Spanish ulcer continued to drain French resources, and most dangerously, Napoleon's alliance with Russia was deteriorating, as both emperors realized their interests were fundamentally incompatible. But Napoleon, drunk on his own success, couldn't see the warning sign. Each problem looked like another opportunity to demonstrate his genius. Spanish resistance? He would show them what real war looked like. Austrian defiance? He would crush them again. Russian intransigence? He would march to Moscow and dictate terms from the Kremlin. Napoleon had become addicted to the drug of military victory, and like any addict, he needed bigger and more dangerous doses to achieve the same high. The Peninsular War, 1807-1814, began because Portugal refused to close its ports to British trade. Napoleon's solution was to march an army through Spain to force Portuguese compliance, but the Spanish royal family's incompetence gave him an even more tempting opportunity. When the Spanish king abdicated in favor of Napoleon's brother Joseph, Napoleon thought he'd gained control of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Instead, he'd stumbled into the first modern guerrilla war, a conflict that would bleed French resources for 7 years and teach Europe that Napoleon's armies could be defeated. The Spanish didn't fight Napoleon's armies in conventional battles they couldn't win. They fought a war of ambush, assassination, and attrition that turned occupied Spain into a nightmare for French forces. Supply convoys were attacked, isolated garrisons were massacred, and French officials were murdered in their beds. Napoleon had encountered an enemy that couldn't be defeated by tactical brilliance. an entire population that refused to accept occupation. Napoleon's fundamental misunderstanding of Spanish resistance stemmed from his assumption that people were essentially rational actors who would accept whatever government could provide the most effective administration. In Italy and Germany, French occupation had often been welcomed because it brought more efficient government, better roads, and more rational legal system. Napoleon expected Spanish civilians to appreciate French improvements in infrastructure and administration, and he couldn't comprehend why they preferred their own corrupt and inefficient government to his superior foreign one. The Spanish guerrilla war was particularly frustrating for Napoleon because it violated all the military principles that had made him successful. Guerrillas didn't concentrate their forces where he could defeat them decisively. They didn't defend territory that he could conquer and hold. They didn't have a capital that he could capture, or a government that he could negotiate with. Instead, they fought a war of 1,000 small engagements, none decisive in itself, but collectively devastating to French morale and resources. The psychological impact of the Spanish War on French forces was almost as important as the material damage. French soldiers who had conquered Prussia and Austria found themselves being picked off by Spanish peasants, who disappeared into the countryside after each attack. Veterans who had fought at Austerlitz and Jena were reduced to escorting supply convoy through hostile territory where any civilian might be an enemy combatant. The invincible Grande Armée was learning that military supremacy meant nothing if you couldn't tell who your enemies were. Napoleon's response to Spanish resistance demonstrated both his tactical flexibility and his strategic blindness. He could adapt his military techniques to deal with guerrilla warfare, developing new methods for controlling hostile populations and protecting extended supply lines. But he couldn't understand that the problem wasn't military technique, it was political legitimacy. The Spanish weren't resisting French administration because it was inefficient, they were resisting it because it was foreign. The Spanish War also marked the beginning of Napoleon's serious collaboration with British ground forces, as Wellington's army provided a conventional military threat that complemented Spanish guerrilla operations. This combination of regular and irregular warfare created a strategic nightmare for French commanders, who had to simultaneously defend against British offensive operations and Spanish harassment. It was like trying to fight two completely different wars at the same time, and Napoleon's generals were discovering that tactical brilliance designed for conventional European warfare was inadequate for this new kind of conflict. Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, proved to be exactly the kind of opponent that Napoleon was least equipped to handle. Patient, methodical, and completely unimpressed by Napoleonic legend. While other European generals tried to match Napoleon's speed and aggression, Wellington fought a defensive war that neutralized French advantages in mobility and concentration of force. He chose his battles carefully, never engaging unless he had clear advantages, and was perfectly willing to retreat rather than risk unnecessary casualty. The economic cost of the Spanish War was staggering even by Napoleonic standards. France was maintaining armies of over 200,000 men in hostile territory that provided no significant resources to offset the expense of occupation. Every French soldier in Spain had to be supplied from France. Every French official had to be protected by French bayonets, and every French position had to be fortified against constant attack. Spain was consuming French resources at a rate that made even Napoleon's expensive victories look economical by comparison. Meanwhile, the Fourth Coalition, 1806-1807, gave Napoleon another chance to demonstrate his battlefield genius against more conventional enemies. Prussia, convinced that Napoleon could be defeated by superior discipline and traditional tactics, learned otherwise at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. Napoleon's armies didn't just defeat the Prussians, they annihilated them so completely that the Prussian army essentially ceased to exist as a fighting. King Frederick William III fled to Russia, leaving Napoleon to occupy Berlin and dictate terms from the palace of Frederick the Great. The Prussian campaign demonstrated Napoleon at his most ruthlessly efficient. He had destroyed what was considered one of Europe's finest military establishments in less than a month, using speed and superior concentration of force to achieve victories that earlier generations would have considered impossible. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt was particularly impressive because Napoleon was actually fighting two separate battles simultaneously, with different portions of his army engaging different Prussian forces, both achieving decisive victories on the same day. But even crushing Prussia wasn't enough to end the war. Russia remained in the field, and Napoleon found himself campaigning in Poland against enemies who had learned not to fight him conventionally. The battles of Eylau and Friedland were French victories, but they were costly victories against enemies who were learning to adapt to Napoleon's methods. The myth of French invincibility was beginning to crack. though it would be several more years before anyone dared to admit it publicly. The Battle of Eylau, fought in a Polish blizzard in February 1807, was Napoleon's first taste of what modern warfare could become when both sides had competent leadership and adequate resources. The Russians under Bennigsen fought with the kind of stubborn determination that made French victories Pyrrhic at best. When the battle ended, both armies had suffered enormous casualties. The strategic situation was essentially unchanged, and Napoleon found himself occupying territory that might not be worth the cost of holding it. Friedland in June 1807 restored Napoleon's reputation for decisive victory, but even this triumph revealed troubling trends. The battle was won through superior French artillery and the tactical mistakes of Russian commanders, not through the kind of strategic brilliance that had characterized Napoleon's earlier campaigns. French casualties were still heavy, and the Russian army retreated in good order rather than disintegrating as earlier opponents had. Napoleon was still winning, but winning was becoming more expensive and less decisive. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 should have been Napoleon's greatest diplomatic triumph. Meeting with Tsar Alexander V on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, Napoleon convinced the Russian emperor to join the continental system and divide European influence between France and Russia. On paper, Napoleon had achieved the impossible. He had turned his greatest enemy into his ally. In practice, he had created the conditions for his own destruction. The Tilsit Agreement was a masterpiece of diplomatic theatre that concealed fundamental incompatibilities between French and Russian interests. Alexander agreed to support the continental system, but Russian nobles depended on British trade for their wealth. Alexander accepted French hegemony in Western Europe, but Russian strategic interests required influence in Poland and the Ottoman Empire. Alexander promised to cooperate with French foreign policy, but Russian domestic politics made it impossible to subordinate national interests to French convenience indefinitely. The alliance with Russia was built on mutual self-interest, not trust, and the continental system put impossible strain on Russian interests. Russia's economy depended on trade with Britain, and forcing Russian compliance with French trade policy created resentment that would eventually explode into war. Napoleon had won a diplomatic victory that guaranteed future military conflict. The raft at Tilsit had become a time bomb that would detonate in the frozen wastes outside Moscow. By 1809, Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe, either directly or through puppet states. But controlling territory and governing it effectively are two very different things. The War of the Fifth Coalition brought Austria back into conflict with France, resulting in Napoleon's victory at Wagram. But even victory was becoming more difficult. Austrian resistance was better organized, French allies were less reliable, and Napoleon's own forces were showing signs of strain from constant campaigning. The Battle of Wagram in July 1809 was typical of Napoleon's later victory, strategically successful but tactically costly. The Austrians under Archduke Charles had learned to fight more like Napoleon himself, using rapid movement and concentrated attacks to maximize their advantages. Napoleon still won the battle, but at a price that would have been unthinkable during his early campaigns. The margin between victory and defeat was narrowing, and everyone could see it. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 was supposed to seal his integration into European royalty, but it also demonstrated how far he had traveled from his revolutionary origins. The man who had once proclaimed the end of monarchy was now desperate to join the club of European sovereigns. He divorced Josephine, the woman who had supported him during his rise to power, to marry an 18-year-old Habsburg princess who represented everything the French Revolution had supposedly been fighting against. The dynastic marriage was a calculated political move designed to legitimize Napoleon's rule and secure his succession, but it also revealed his growing isolation from French public opinion. Revolutionary France had fought wars against Habsburg Austria for decades. Now their emperor was married to a Habsburg archduchess and father to a half-Habsburg heir. The symbolism was unmistakable. Napoleon had become the very thing he had once fought to destroy. The cracks in Napoleon's empire were becoming visible to anyone who cared to look. The continental system was creating economic hardship across Europe without significantly damaging British trade. Nationalist movements were stirring in Germany and Italy, inspired partly by French revolutionary ideas and partly by resentment against French domination. The Spanish ulcer continued to drain French resources while teaching Europe that French armies could be defeated. And most dangerously, Napoleon's alliance with Russia was deteriorating as both emperors realized their interests were fundamentally incompatible. But Napoleon, drunk on his own success, couldn't see the warning signs. Each problem looked like another opportunity to demonstrate his genius. Spanish resistance? He would show them what real war looked like. Austrian defiance? He would crush them again. Russian intransigence? He would march to Moscow and dictate terms from the Kremlin. Napoleon had become addicted to the drug of military victory, and like any addict, he needed bigger and more dangerous doses to achieve the same high. The birth of Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, in 1811, should have given him a reason to consolidate his gains and focus on creating a stable succession. Instead, it convinced him that he needed to secure an even greater inheritance for his heir. A son who would inherit the throne of France deserved to inherit an empire that would make Rome look like a provincial kingdom. Napoleon began planning what would become his greatest campaign and his ultimate disaster, the invasion of Russia. The decision to invade Russia wasn't made in a moment of madness. It was the logical culmination of everything Napoleon had done since seizing power in 1799. Every previous victory had required a greater victory to secure it. Every conquered territory demanded new conquests to protect it. Every defeated enemy had to be crushed completely to prevent future resistance. Napoleon had created a system that required constant expansion to maintain itself, and Russia was the only remaining obstacle to French hegemony in Europe. Alexander I's gradual withdrawal from the continental system wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was an existential threat to Napoleon's entire imperial project. If Russia could defy French trade policy with impunity, other nations would follow suit. If the continental system collapsed, Britain would recover its European markets and resume funding anti-French coalitions. If Napoleon allowed Russia to escape his control, his empire would begin unraveling from its eastern borders. From Napoleon's perspective, the invasion of Russia wasn't optional, it was inevitable. By 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled more of Europe than anyone since Charlemagne, but it still wasn't enough. Russia's gradual withdrawal from the continental system wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was a personal insult to a man who had grown accustomed to reshaping international law with cannon fire. Napoleon's solution to the Russian problem was characteristically direct and monumentally stupid. He would invade Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen, march to Moscow, and force Tsar Alexander to submit. It was the kind of plan that could only be conceived by someone who had never met a military problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower and tactical genius. The planning for the Russian invasion revealed both Napoleon's organizational genius and his complete detachment from reality. The logistics required to move 600,000 men across Eastern Europe were staggering. Millions of pounds of food, hundreds of thousands of horseshoes, tens of thousands of wagons, an entire mobile infrastructure to support the largest military force in human history. Napoleon threw himself into these preparations with the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized his earlier campaigns, personally reviewing supply schedules and march routes with the enthusiasm of a man planning the ultimate military adventure. But the scale of the Russian invasion also revealed the fundamental weakness in Napoleon's strategic thinking. His assumption that bigger was always better. Previous campaigns had succeeded through speed and concentration of force. The Russian invasion would require managing supply lines stretching across a continent and coordinating movements of an army larger than the population of most European cities. Napoleon was attempting to apply tactical principles that worked with 50,000 men to a force of 600,000, apparently believing that military genius scaled infinitely upward. The Grande Armée that assembled in 1812 was a truly international force. 600,000 men from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Austria, and a dozen other nations, all united under Napoleon's banner for the conquest of Russia. It was the largest invasion force in human history up to that point, a military instrument so massive that its mere existence should have intimidated any rational opponent into immediate surrender. The problem was that Russia had never been particularly rational about military matters, and the Russian winter didn't negotiate with anyone, regardless of how many battles they'd won. The diversity of the Grande Armée was both a strength and a fatal weakness. French veterans provided the professional corps, but the majority of the force consisted of recently conquered peoples whose loyalty to Napoleon was questionable at best. German soldiers were fighting for an emperor who had occupied their homelands. Italian troops were serving a master who had turned their peninsula into a French satellite. Polish units were the most motivated, hoping that French victory would restore their independence. But even they had good reasons to doubt Napoleon's long-term commitment to Polish interests. Napoleon's plan was elegant in its simplicity. advance rapidly into Russia, force the Russian army into a decisive battle, destroy them completely, and dictate terms from St. Petersburg. It was the same strategy that had worked against Austria, Prussia, and every other continental power. What Napoleon failed to appreciate was that Russia was different. Russia was vast enough to absorb entire armies, harsh enough to kill them through attrition, and desperate enough to sacrifice anything, including its own capital, to avoid defeat. The Russian strategy, developed largely by General Barclay de Tolly and later implemented by Field Marshal Kutuzov, was brilliantly simple: retreat, destroy everything useful, and let the Russian climate do what Russian armies couldn't. It was the strategic equivalent of scorched earth tactics applied on a continental scale. Every village was evacuated, every barn was burned, every bridge was destroyed. The Grande Armée would find nothing to sustain itself except what it carried from France. The invasion began on June 24, 1812, with Napoleon crossing the Niemen River at the head of his massive army. For the first few weeks, everything proceeded according to plan. Russian forces retreated before the French advance, avoiding the decisive battle Napoleon desperately wanted. Cities were abandoned, supplies were destroyed, and the Russian countryside was systematically stripped of anything that might sustain an. Napoleon interpreted this as cowardice. In fact, it was the most intelligent strategy Russia could have. The early stages of the Russian campaign demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Napoleon's approach to warfare. The Grande Armée moved with impressive speed for such a massive force, covering distances that would have been impossible for earlier armies. French organizational efficiency was evident in the coordination of multiple corps advancing on parallel routes toward common objectives. But the sheer size of the army was creating logistical problems that even Napoleon's administrative genius couldn't solve. By the time Napoleon realized that the Russians weren't going to fight a conventional campaign, it was too late to change course. His army was already deep in Russian territory, dependent on increasingly precarious supply lines, and facing the first signs of the attrition that would eventually destroy them. Soldiers were deserting, horses were dying from inadequate feed, and the infamous Russian roads were turning supply trains into slow-motion disasters. The Grande Armée was melting away before it had fought a single major battle. The psychological warfare that the Russians were conducting was almost as effective as their military strategy. French soldiers who had expected to be welcomed as liberators found empty villages and hostile populations. Veterans who had grown accustomed to living off conquered territory discovered that there was nothing. The army that had conquered Europe was learning what it felt like to be genuinely unwelcome in a foreign land. Napoleon's growing frustration with Russian tactics was evident in his increasingly desperate attempts to force a decisive engagement. He had built his reputation on quick campaigns and crushing victories. The Russian strategy of endless retreat was denying him the kind of glorious battle that would justify the enormous cost of the invasion. Each day of Russian retreat was a day of French deterioration, and Napoleon was beginning to realize that time was not on his side. The Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812, gave Napoleon the decisive engagement he had been seeking, but it was nothing like the clean victories he had grown accustomed to. The Russian army under Kutuzov didn't break under French attack. Instead, they absorbed horrific casualties and gave almost as good as they got. Napoleon won the field, but at a cost that would have been unthinkable at Austerlitz. The Grande Armée lost 35,000 men in a single day, including many of Napoleon's most experienced officers and veterans. Worse still, the Russians retreated in good order after Borodino, leaving Napoleon with a Pyrrhic victory that solved none of his strategic problems. He had broken the Russian army but not destroyed it. He had won a battle but not the war. And most critically, he had sacrificed irreplaceable men and resources for the privilege of advancing even deeper into Russian territory as winter approached. Napoleon had achieved everything he thought he wanted, and it wasn't enough. By 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled more of Europe than anyone since Charlemagne, but it still wasn't enough. Russia's gradual withdrawal from the continental system wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was a personal insult to a man who had grown accustomed to reshaping international law with cannon fire. Napoleon's solution to the Russian problem was characteristically direct and monumentally stupid. He would invade Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen, march to Moscow, and force Tsar Alexander to submit. It was the kind of plan that could only be conceived by someone who had never met a military problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower and tactical genius. The Grande Armée that assembled in 1812 was a truly international 600,000 men from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Austria, and a dozen other nations, all united under Napoleon's banner for the conquest of Russia. It was the largest invasion force in human history up to that point, a military instrument so massive that its mere existence should have intimidated any rational opponent into immediate surrender. The problem was that Russia had never been particularly rational about military, and the Russian winter didn't negotiate with anyone, regardless of how many battles they'd won. Napoleon's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Advance rapidly into Russia, force the Russian army into a decisive battle, destroy them completely, and dictate terms from St. Petersburg. It was the same strategy that had worked against Austria, Prussia, and every other continental power. What Napoleon failed to appreciate was that Russia was different. Russia was vast enough to absorb entire armies, harsh enough to kill them through attrition, and desperate enough to sacrifice anything, including its own capital, to avoid defeat. The invasion began on June 24, 1812, with Napoleon crossing the Niemen River at the head of his massive army. For the first few weeks, everything proceeded according to plan. Russian forces retreated before the French advance, avoiding the decisive battle that Napoleon desperately wanted. Cities were abandoned, supplies were destroyed, and the Russian countryside was systematically stripped of anything that might sustain an occupying army. Napoleon interpreted this as cowardice. In fact, it was the most intelligent strategy Russia could have pursued. By the time Napoleon realized that the Russians weren't going to fight a conventional campaign, it was too late to change course. His army was already deep in Russian territory, dependent on increasingly precarious supply lines, and facing the first signs of the attrition that would eventually destroy them. Soldiers were deserting, horses were dying, and the infamous Russian roads were turning supply trains into slow-motion disasters. The Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812, gave Napoleon the decisive engagement he had been seeking, but it was nothing like the clean victories he had grown accustomed to. The Russian army under Kutuzov didn't break under French attack. Instead, they absorbed horrific casualties and gave almost as good as they got. Napoleon won the field, but at a cost that would have been unthinkable at Austerlitz. The Grande Armée lost 35,000 men in a single day, including many of Napoleon's most experienced officers and veterans. Worse still, the Russians retreated in good order after Borodino, leaving Napoleon with a Pyrrhic victory that solved none of his strategic problem. He had broken the Russian army but not destroyed it. He had won a battle but not the war. And most critically, he had sacrificed irreplaceable men and resources for the privilege of advancing even deeper into Russian territory as winter approached. Napoleon's entry into Moscow on September 14, 1812, should have been his moment of triumph, the culmination of his greatest campaign. Instead, he found an abandoned city that burst into flames within hours of his arrival. The Russians had evacuated Moscow and then burned it, denying Napoleon the political victory he needed to justify the enormous cost of his invasion. There was no Russian delegation waiting to negotiate surrender, no tribute to be collected, no submission to be accepted. There was just an empty, burning city and the sound of winter approaching. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow for a Russian surrender that would never come. This was perhaps the most critical period of his entire career, the moment when strategic genius needed to overcome personal pride. Any competent military commander would have recognized that the campaign had failed, that winter was coming, and that retreat was the only sensible option. But Napoleon wasn't just a military commander, he was Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had never accepted defeat, and retreat felt too much like admitting that his enemies had outsmarted him. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow on October 19, 1812, it was already too late to avoid disaster. The Russian winter arrived early that year, and the Grande Armée found itself retreating through a landscape that had been deliberately stripped of supplies, harassed by Cossack raids, and decimated by cold, hunger, and disease. Men who had marched into Russia as conquerors died as frozen corpses by the roadside. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's greatest military catastrophes, a slow-motion apocalypse that destroyed Napoleon's reputation for invincibility. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, perhaps 30,000 effective soldiers made it back to France. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered across Eastern Europe. Napoleon had gambled his empire on the Russian campaign and lost everything except his life and his throne. The most damaging aspect of the Russian disaster wasn't the military defeat. It was the revelation that Napoleon was fallible. For 15 years, he had built his authority on the assumption that he was a military genius who couldn't be defeated. Russia proved that Napoleon could be outmaneuvered, that his armies could be destroyed, and that his judgment was catastrophically flawed. Every enemy of France took note, and every ally began reconsidering their commitments. Napoleon himself escaped the Russian debacle by abandoning his army and racing back to Paris, where he immediately began raising new forces to replace the men he had lost. His response to the greatest military disaster in history was to start planning another campaign. This wasn't resilience, this was pathology. Napoleon had become so addicted to warfare that even the destruction of his greatest army couldn't convince him to pursue peace. The Sixth Coalition formed almost immediately after news of the Russian disaster reached Europe. Prussia, Austria, Britain, Russia and Sweden united against France with the kind of determination that only comes from seeing a previously invincible enemy revealed as mortal. Napoleon would fight brilliant campaigns in 1813 and 1814, win tactical victories against impossible odds, and demonstrate that his military genius hadn't abandoned him. But he was no longer fighting for conquest, he was fighting for survival, and survival wars have a different dynamic than wars of aggression. The War of the Sixth Coalition, 1813-1814, was Napoleon at his most desperate and, paradoxically, his most tactically brilliant. With his Grande Armée destroyed in Russia and all of Europe united against him, Napoleon faced the kind of impossible odds that would have driven a sensible person to negotiate. Instead, he threw himself into the conflict with the manic energy of a man who had decided that if he was going down, he would take as many enemies with him as possible. The campaigns of 1813-1814 were Napoleon's greatest performance as a pure military tactician, but they were also the final proof that tactical genius without strategic wisdom is just an expensive way to lose. Napoleon's first challenge was rebuilding an army from scratch. The seasoned veterans who had conquered Europe were dead in Russian snow, and their replacements were teenagers and middle-aged conscripts who barely knew which end of a musket to hold. Napoleon compensated with the kind of frenetic energy that had made him famous, personally drilling raw recruits, reorganizing supply systems, and somehow creating a functioning army out of material that shouldn't have been able to fight a local militia, let alone the combined forces of Europe. The German campaign of 1813 began with Napoleon demonstrating that reports of his military death had been greatly exaggerated. At Lutzen and Bautzen, he defeated Prussian and Russian forces with armies that existed more on paper than in reality. These weren't the crushing victories of his prime, but they were victories nonetheless, proof that Napoleon could still outfight enemies, even when dramatically outnumbered and outgunned. But winning battles wasn't enough anymore. Napoleon needed to win the war, and the war had changed in fundamental ways. His enemies had learned to fight like using speed, coordination, and combined arms tactics. More importantly, they had learned to avoid fighting him when he was strong and attack when he was weak. The coalition strategy was simple: wear down French forces through constant pressure, avoid decisive battles unless they had overwhelming advantages, and wait for Napoleon's inevitable mistakes. The turning point came at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations because it involved more countries and more soldiers than any previous European conflict. Napoleon found himself facing a coalition army of 365,000 men, with a French force of 190,000, many of whom were recent conscripts with minimal training. For 3 days, Napoleon fought with the kind of tactical brilliance that had made him famous, but tactical brilliance couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. On the third day, his Saxon allies defected in the middle of the battle, and the French army collapsed. Leipzig was Napoleon's Waterloo before Waterloo, the moment when even his most loyal supporters realized that the empire was doomed. The retreat from Leipzig became another catastrophic rout, with Napoleon's army disintegrating as it fell back toward the Rhine. Germany, which had been under French domination for nearly a decade, erupted in nationalist uprising. Former allies switched sides with the enthusiasm of dinner guests abandoning a sinking ship. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved overnight. Napoleon's response to the Leipzig disaster was characteristically insane. He would fight on, defend France itself, and somehow achieve victory through pure force of will. The campaign of France in 1814 was Napoleon's last stand, and in many ways his most impressive performance. Outnumbered by coalition forces advancing on multiple fronts, Napoleon fought a series of brilliant defensive actions that demonstrated every aspect of his military genius. At Champaubert, Montmirail, and Vauchamp, he defeated Allied forces that should have crushed his makeshift armies. But tactical victories couldn't solve strategic problems. France was exhausted after 20 years of constant warfare. The economy was collapsing, and Napoleon's own marshals were beginning to question his judgment. When the coalition offered terms that would have left Napoleon as ruler of France within its traditional borders, his advisors urged acceptance. Napoleon's response was to demand terms that would have let him keep most of his conquests. The man who couldn't stop fighting couldn't stop conquering, even when conquest meant certain destruction. The fall of Paris on March 31st, 1814, ended Napoleon's first reign in the most anticlimactic way possible. His own Senate voted to depose him while he was still trying to organize the defense of France. The marshals who had followed him across Europe refused to march on Paris to restore his authority. The empire that had been built on military victory collapsed the moment military victory became impossible. Napoleon's abdication at Fontainebleau was the final act of a man who had gambled everything on his ability to reshape Europe through warfare. The coalition powers, demonstrating either remarkable mercy or remarkable stupidity, allowed him to retain the title of emperor and gave him sovereignty over the island of Elba. It was a comfortable retirement for history's most successful conqueror, the kind of golden exile that should have satisfied anyone who had already achieved more than Alexander the Great. But Napoleon wasn't anyone, and Elba wasn't enough. For 10 months, the former emperor of the French ruled over an island with 12,000 inhabitants and brooded about his lost empire. He read dispatches about the Congress of Vienna, where European powers were redrawing the map without consulting him. He watched French politics from afar as the restored Bourbon monarchy proved that the only thing worse than Napoleonic dictatorship was legitimate royal incompetence. And slowly, inevitably, he began planning his return. The 100 Days began on March 1st, 1815, when Napoleon landed in France with 1,000 men and a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on your perspective. His strategy was to rely on the loyalty of the French people and army to restore him to power without firing a shot. Incredibly, it worked. Soldiers sent to arrest him joined his cause instead. Marshals who had abandoned him at Fontainebleau rallied to his banner. Within 20 days, Napoleon was back in, and Louis XVI was fleeing to Belgium. But Europe had learned not to trust Napoleon's promises of peaceful intention. The Seventh Coalition formed immediately, and Napoleon found himself facing the same enemies who had defeated him the year before, except now they were more experienced, better coordinated, and absolutely determined to end the Napoleonic threat permanently. Napoleon had one last chance to prove that his military genius could overcome impossible odds, and characteristically, he decided to attack. The Waterloo campaign of June 1815 was Napoleon's last roll of the dice, his final attempt to prove that tactical brilliance could overcome strategic insanity. With coalition armies converging on France from multiple directions, Napoleon chose to strike first, hoping to defeat his enemies piecemeal before they could coordinate their overwhelming numerical advantage. It was a sound strategy from a military perspective, but it was also the desperate gamble of a man who had never learned when to quit. Napoleon's plan was elegant in its simplicity. March into Belgium, drive a wedge between the British and Prussian armies, destroy them separately, and then turn to face the Austrian and Russian forces advancing from the east. If executed properly, it might have worked. The British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher were indeed separated and vulnerable to defeat in detail, but, if executed properly, was doing a lot of heavy lifting for a plan that required perfect coordination, faultless timing, and a level of military competence that Napoleon's hastily assembled army simply didn't possess. The campaign began promisingly enough. Napoleon's initial advance caught his enemies off guard, and at Ligny on June 16th, he inflicted a serious defeat on Blücher's Prussian army. It was the kind of tactical victory that had made Napoleon's reputation, but it wasn't the crushing blow that would have knocked Prussia out of the campaign. Blücher's army retreated in reasonably good order, and more importantly, it retreated in a direction that would allow it to support Wellington if necessary. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney's attack on the British at Quatre Bras was supposed to pin Wellington's army in place, while Napoleon destroyed Blücher. Instead, Ney fought an inconclusive battle that allowed Wellington to withdraw to a defensive position of his choosing. Napoleon had achieved tactical success without strategic advantage, winning battles without winning the campaign. It was becoming a pattern. The stage was set for June 18, 1815, at Waterloo, where Napoleon would face Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, in what would become the most famous battle in European history. Wellington had chosen his ground carefully, a ridge south of Brussels that offered excellent defensive positions and, crucially, was close enough to the Prussian line of retreat that Blücher might be able to provide support if he could reorganize his forces quickly enough. Napoleon's battle plan at Waterloo reflected both his genius and his fatal flaws. The French would attack Wellington's centre after a preliminary bombardment, break through the British line, and then roll up the flanks. It was the kind of frontal assault that had worked at Austerlitz and Friedland, but Wellington wasn't commanding Austrians or Russians. The British infantry were the finest in Europe, disciplined enough to stand under bombardment and experienced enough to make French attacks prohibitively expensive. The battle began with Napoleon's characteristic artillery barrage, but the wet ground from the previous night's rain absorbed much of the impact, and Wellington had positioned most of his forces on the reverse slope of the ridge, protected from direct fire. The French bombardment was impressive but ineffective, a waste of ammunition that Napoleon couldn't afford to squander. When the French infantry finally advanced, they encountered the kind of disciplined resistance that had made British forces famous. Wellington's squares held firm against French cavalry charges that should have broken lesser formations. The farmhouse of Hougoumont became a miniature fortress that consumed French resources without providing strategic advantage. Every French attack was repulsed, but at a cost that both armies could ill afford. Napoleon's biggest mistake at Waterloo wasn't tactical, it was psychological. He had convinced himself that Wellington was an inferior general commanding inferior troops, an assumption that led him to launch increasingly desperate attacks against positions that should have been bypassed or ignored. The Emperor, who had once outmaneuvered Austria's finest generals, was reduced to battering his head against British squares in the hope that sheer persistence would somehow achieve what intelligence had failed to accomplish. The arrival of Blücher's Prussians in the late afternoon turned a difficult battle into an impossible one. Napoleon had gambled that the Prussians were too badly mauled at Ligny to intervene at Waterloo, but Blücher had reorganized his forces with the kind of determination that comes from a personal hatred of one's opponent. The Prussian attack on Napoleon's right flank meant he was now fighting two armies simultaneously, a challenge that would have tested him even at the height of his powers. Napoleon's final gamble was the charge of the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve that had never been defeated in battle. If the Guard could break Wellington's centre, the British army might still collapse and give Napoleon the victory he desperately needed. But the Guard's attack was poorly coordinated, launched against prepared positions by men who were exhausted from a day of fighting. When Wellington's infantry stood firm and the Guard began to retreat, the psychological impact was devastating. The French army, which had held together through hours of slaughter, suddenly collapsed. The Battle of Waterloo ended with Napoleon's army in full retreat, and the Emperor himself fleeing toward Paris with the remnants of his imperial dignity. It was a complete disaster, the kind of defeat that ends careers and topples empires. But it was also, in a perverse way, the perfect ending to Napoleon's story. The man who had lived by the sword had finally died by it, defeated not by political intrigue or popular uprising, but by superior generalship on a battlefield of his own choosing. Napoleon's return to Paris after Waterloo was a journey into irrelevance. The French people, exhausted by decades of warfare, had no appetite for another last stand. The legislature voted no confidence in their returned emperor. Even his most loyal supporters urged abdication. Napoleon, the master of political theatre, found himself playing to an empty house. His second abdication on June 22, 1815, lacked even the dignity of the first. This time, there would be no comfortable exile to a Mediterranean island. The British, taking no chances with Napoleon's ability to inspire comebacks, shipped him to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic that was about as far from Europe as it was possible to get without leaving the planet entirely. St. Helena was the perfect prison for Napoleon Bonaparte, isolated, inescapable, and boring enough to drive a man of action slowly insane. The island lay 200 miles from the nearest landmass, surrounded by British warships and populated by a few thousand residents who had the distinct honor of guarding history's most famous prisoner. For a man who had reshaped the map of Europe, governed 70 million people, and commanded armies of 500,000 soldiers, St. Helena represented the ultimate humiliation, complete and utter irrelevance. The journey to St. Helena aboard HMS Northumberland was Napoleon's final taste of the diplomatic courtesy that had once been his due as Emperor of the French. The British government treated him as a prisoner of war rather than a deposed sovereign, a deliberate insult that Napoleon found almost as galling as the exile itself. Captain Frederick Maitland was respectful but firm. Napoleon was no longer an emperor, no longer a general, no longer even a French citizen. He was simply a dangerous man being transported to a place where he could do no more. Napoleon's residence at Longwood House was comfortable enough for a deposed emperor, but it was still a prison. British restrictions limited his movements, monitored his correspondence, and subjected him to the kind of bureaucratic petty tyranny that was probably more psychologically damaging than physical hardship would have been. The man who had once issued decrees that reshaped international law now had to ask permission to ride his horse beyond a specified boundary. Every aspect of his daily routine was subject to British oversight, a constant reminder that he was no longer the master of his own fate. The climate of St. Helena was particularly cruel for someone of Napoleon's temperament. The island's subtropical weather was humid, windy, and unpredictable, creating the kind of physical discomfort that made every day feel like a trial. Napoleon, who had thrived in the variety and challenge of European campaigns, found himself trapped in monotonous routine on a rock in the middle of the ocean. For a man who had once controlled the destiny of nations, the weather became an enemy he couldn't defeat or escape. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Napoleon's exile was that it gave him unlimited time to think about what he had achieved and what he had thrown away. Cut off from the adrenaline rush of campaign planning and battlefield command, Napoleon was forced to confront the reality of his choices. He had controlled most of Europe and lost it. He had commanded the loyalty of millions and died with a handful of servants. He had been offered reasonable peace terms multiple times and rejected them all in pursuit of total victory that ultimately became total defeat. Napoleon's small entourage of loyal followers on St. Helena provided both companionship and constant reminders of his fall from grace. General Bertrand, Count Montholon, and the young Emmanuel Las Cases were devoted to their former emperor, but they were also living proof of how far he had fallen. Men who had once commanded armies and governed provinces were reduced to playing cards and taking dictation on a remote island. Their loyalty was touching, but it was also a daily reminder that Napoleon had destroyed not just his own career, but the careers of everyone who had trusted him. Napoleon's years on St. Helena produced some of the most psychologically revealing documents in history. His memoirs, dictated to various companions, were an exercise in creative historical revision that painted him as a misunderstood champion of European civilization, rather than a warmonger who had gotten millions of people killed for his personal aggrandizement. According to Napoleon's version of events, he had been fighting for liberty, equality, and progress against the reactionary forces of monarchy and privilege. It was a compelling narrative that conveniently ignored his transformation into an absolute monarch and his use of warfare as a tool for personal advancement. The most fascinating aspect of Napoleon's St. Helena years was his gradual recognition of his own flaws, though he never quite admitted them directly. In conversations with his companions, he acknowledged that perhaps he had been too ambitious, that maybe he should have accepted the peace offer that would have left him ruler of France. But even these admissions came wrapped in justifications and excuses. Napoleon couldn't bring himself to say that he had been wrong. He could only admit that he had been unlucky. The psychological dynamics of Napoleon's exile were complicated by his continuing belief that he might somehow return to power. Every British ship that arrived at St. Helena brought hope that political changes in Europe might create new opportunities. Napoleon followed European politics obsessively, analyzing every diplomatic development for signs that his enemies were weakening or that his supporters were organizing. The man who had staged one impossible comeback from Elba couldn't quite accept that his political career was permanently finished. Napoleon's relationship with his British captor was a fascinating study in mutual respect and antagonism. Governor Hudson Lowe was tasked with preventing Napoleon's escape while maintaining the basic courtesies due to a former head of state. Napoleon chafed against British restrictions while secretly admiring British efficiency and determination. The two men developed a grudging professional relationship based on their shared understanding that each was doing his duty in an impossible situation. The intellectual isolation of St. Helena was almost as difficult for Napoleon as the physical confinement. Cut off from the flow of European political and military information that had sustained him throughout his career, Napoleon was reduced to reading whatever books the British were willing to provide. He devoured historical work, particularly accounts of other great military, constantly comparing their achievements to his own. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Charlemagne became his companions in exile, fellow conquerors whose stories provided both inspiration and consolation. Napoleon's health declined steadily during his exile, possibly from stomach cancer, possibly from arsenic poisoning, possibly from the simple fact that a man built for action was slowly dying for activity. He complained constantly about the climate, the food, the accommodations, and the British restrictions, but these complaints had the pathetic quality of a caged lion roaring at zoo visitors. The Emperor of the French had been reduced to a tourist attraction, a living reminder of how quickly the mighty can fall. The final years of Napoleon's life were marked by increasing physical weakness and growing philosophical reflection. The man who had once dismissed religion as the opium of the people began showing interest in Catholic theology. The emperor, who had treated human life as a strategic resource, began expressing concern about the souls of soldiers who had died in his campaigns. Whether this represented genuine spiritual awakening or merely the fear of a dying man is unclear, but it suggested that even Napoleon was not completely immune to the weight of his actions. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. His last words reportedly, "France, army, head of the army, Josephine." Even in death, he couldn't escape the obsessions that had defined his life, his country, his soldiers, and the woman he had divorced for political advantage. His death was as anticlimactic as his exile, the quiet end of a man whose life had been defined by sound and fury. The British authorities conducted an autopsy, buried him with appropriate ceremony, and filed their final reports on the most dangerous prisoner in history. But Napoleon's death was not quite the end of his story. Within decades, his legend had begun to eclipse his reality. The French, suffering under the restored Bourbon monarchy and then the uninspiring July monarchy, began to remember Napoleon not as the dictator who had led them into disaster, but as the great leader who had made France the dominant power in Europe. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, would eventually become Napoleon III, proving that the French had an almost supernatural ability to repeat their mistakes. The Napoleon legend that emerged after his death was a masterpiece of historical revisionism. He became the champion of nationalism, the defender of revolutionary ideals, the man who had spread liberty across Europe at the point of a bayonet. The inconvenient facts about his dictatorial rule, his disastrous campaigns, and his complete indifference to human suffering were quietly forgotten in favor of stories of his genius, his charisma, and his tragic fall. Death had accomplished what life never could. It had transformed Napoleon from a failed dictator into a romantic hero. This mythologized Napoleon was arguably more dangerous than the real one had ever been. The real Napoleon was a brilliant but flawed military leader who had gotten carried away with his own success. The legendary Napoleon was an inspiration for every ambitious general, dictator, and would-be conqueror who came after him. Hitler studied Napoleon's campaigns and made similar mistakes on an even grander scale. Stalin admired Napoleon's political methods and applied them with industrial efficiency. Countless lesser tyrants have modeled themselves on Napoleon's example, usually with disastrous results for their countries and people. To understand the real Napoleon Bonaparte, you need to look past the legend and examine the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that is both more impressive and more horrifying than any mythological account. Between 1803 and 1815, the Napoleonic Wars involved every major European power and most of the minor ones. Conservative estimates put the total death toll at 5 million military casualties and perhaps 1 million civilian deaths, though some historians believe the actual numbers were significantly higher. For perspective, this was roughly equivalent to the entire population of London dying violently over the course of 12 years. Napoleon's supporters argue that these deaths weren't his fault, that he was responding to coalitions formed against him by reactionary monarchies determined to crush the French Revolution. There's some truth to this argument, but it ignores the fundamental reality that Napoleon could have ended the wars at any point by accepting reasonable peace terms. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802 gave him everything a rational leader could have wanted: recognition as ruler of France, acceptance of French territorial gains, and the chance to consolidate power in peacetime. Napoleon broke the peace because he wanted more wars, not because he was forced into them. The human cost of Napoleon's ambition extended far beyond battlefield casualties. The continental system disrupted trade across Europe, causing economic hardship for millions of people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The constant warfare drained government treasuries, forcing rulers to raise taxes and debase currencies. The social disruption caused by armies marching back and forth across the continent created refugees, orphans, and widows on an industrial scale. Perhaps most tragically, Napoleon's wars consumed the flower of European youth for more than a decade. The young men who died at Austerlitz, Leipzig, and Waterloo were the same generation who might otherwise have been building the roads, founding the businesses, writing the books, and composing the music that would have shaped 19th century European civilization. Instead, they died for the greater glory of a Corsican upstart who couldn't bear the thought of anyone else being in charge of anything. Napoleon's political legacy is equally ambiguous. His supporters credit him with spreading the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe, breaking down feudal structures and establishing more rational legal systems. The Napoleonic Code did indeed influence legal development across the world, and French conquest did accelerate the decline of traditional monarchy. But these achievements came at the cost of establishing a template for military dictatorship that would inspire tyrants for the next 2 centuries. The most damning aspect of Napoleon's legacy is that he proved how easily revolutionary ideals could be perverted by personal ambition. The French Revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. Napoleon gave Europe censorship, conscription, and constant warfare. He transformed himself from the defender of popular sovereignty into an absolute monarch whose authority rested on military force and dynastic marriage. Every subsequent dictator who has claimed to represent the people while actually serving only himself has been following Napoleon's playbook. Napoleon's impact on military development was equally double-edged. His innovations in strategy, tactics, and logistics revolutionized warfare and established principles that are still taught in military academies. But his success also convinced a generation of leaders that military problems had military solutions, that diplomatic conflicts could be resolved through superior firepower, and that the way to achieve political goals was to kill enough of your opponents to make them see reason. The cult of Napoleon that developed after his death contributed to a militarization of European culture that would have catastrophic consequences in the 20th century. The generation that fought World War I had grown up on stories of Napoleonic glory, and they marched off to war expecting cavalry charges and heroic victories. Instead, they found machine gun, poison gas, and industrialized slaughter that made Napoleon's casualties look modest in comparison. Perhaps the most important lesson of Napoleon's life is that military genius without moral restraint is more dangerous than military incompetence. An incompetent general loses battles and gets replaced. A brilliant general without scruples conquers continents and inspires imitators. Napoleon's tactical innovations might have been admirable if they had been used defensively, but they were developed and deployed for conquest, which made them contributions to human misery rather than human progress. The tragedy of Napoleon Bonaparte is that he possessed exactly the wrong combination of talents for a civilized world. He had the strategic intelligence to see opportunities, the tactical skill to seize them, the organizational ability to exploit them, and the charisma to convince others to die for his vision. What he lacked was the wisdom to know when to stop, the empathy to care about the human cost of his ambitions, and the humility to accept that some problems don't have military solutions. In the end, Napoleon Bonaparte was exactly what the title of this documentary claims, a man who couldn't stop fighting, even when fighting meant losing everything he had won. His life story reads like a case study in the psychology of addiction, with military victory serving as his drug of choice and Europe as his supplier. Each triumph required a bigger fix. Each conquest demanded a more ambitious follow-up, until he found himself attempting challenges that would have been impossible even at his peak. Napoleon's inability to stop fighting wasn't a character flaw in the conventional sense. It was the logical extension of the qualities that had made him great. His refusal to accept defeat had enabled his early victory. His willingness to take enormous risks had allowed him to achieve the impossible. His conviction that he was destined for greatness had given him the confidence to attempt things that more modest men wouldn't have dared. The same psychological makeup that had made him Emperor of the French also made it impossible for him to enjoy being Emperor of the French. This is perhaps why Napoleon remains such a compelling historical figure more than 2 centuries after his death. He wasn't a monster in the conventional sense. He was a recognizably human figure whose admirable qualities were twisted into destructive obsessions by success and power. Most people can understand the temptation to want more, to push boundaries, to see how far talent and determination can take you. Napoleon's story is a cautionary tale about what happens when that temptation isn't balanced by wisdom, restraint, and genuine concern for others. The questions that Napoleon's life raises are as relevant today as they were in 1815. How much destruction is acceptable in pursuit of great achievements? When does ambition become pathology? Can military genius justify the human cost of constant warfare? Is it possible to reshape civilization through violence? Or does violence inevitably corrupt even the most idealistic goals? Napoleon's life provides answers to these questions, but they're not the answers that anyone wants to hear. If Napoleon had died at Austerlitz, he would be remembered as one of history's greatest military geniuses, a man who rose from obscurity to save France and reshape Europe. If he had accepted reasonable peace terms after Leipzig, he might have been remembered as a wise leader who knew when to consolidate his gains. Instead, He chose to fight until he had nothing left to fight with, and his legacy is that of a brilliant man who destroyed himself and took millions of others with him. The most chilling aspect of Napoleon's story is how easily it could be repeated. The combination of military talent, political ambition, and complete indifference to human suffering that defined Napoleon is not unique in human history. Every generation produces individuals with similar capabilities and similar psychological blind spots. The only thing that prevents more Napoleons from emerging is the institutional constraints that democratic societies place on military leaders and the cultural memory of what happens when those constraints fail. Napoleon's final victory may have been his transformation into a legend that obscures his reality. The Napoleon of popular imagination is a romantic figure, a brilliant general tragically brought down by fate and the jealousy of lesser men. This version of Napoleon makes for better movies and more inspiring stories than the historical reality of a gifted sociopath who spent 2 decades getting people killed for his personal gratification. But the real Napoleon is more important than the legendary, because the real Napoleon shows us what unchecked ambition looks like when combined with genuine talent and unlimited opportunity. He demonstrates that it's possible for someone to be simultaneously a military genius and a moral catastrophe, that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, and that the ability to win battle is not the same as the ability to build a civilization. The man who couldn't stop fighting eventually ran out of enemies he could defeat, ran out of allies he could trust, and ran out of soldiers he could sacrifice. His story ends not with a glorious last stand, but with quiet death in exile, forgotten by the world that had once trembled at his name. It's a fitting end for someone who mistook motion for progress, conquest for achievement, and the ability to destroy for the wisdom to create. Napoleon Bonaparte changed the world, but not in the way he intended. He wanted to be remembered as the man who brought order to chaos, liberty to tyranny, and progress to stagnation. Instead, he's remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited ambition, a reminder that the road to hell is paved with military genius, and proof that some people really can't stop fighting, even when fighting means destroying everything they claim to value. So the next time you encounter someone who insists that violence is the solution to complex problems, that military force can reshape human civilization, or that the end justifies any means necessary, remember Napoleon Bonaparte. Remember the man who conquered most of Europe and lost it all because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving well enough alone. Remember that genius without wisdom is just an expensive way to fail, and that the ability to win battles is worthless if you don't know when to stop fighting them. That's the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who couldn't stop fighting, even when fighting meant losing everything. It's a story that started with a small island in the Mediterranean and ended with an even smaller island in the Atlantic, a reminder that all empires eventually crumble and all emperors eventually die, usually taking far too many innocent people. Thank you for watching, and remember, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and the rhyme scheme usually involves someone convincing themselves that this time will be different. Don't be that someone. Learn from Napoleon's mistakes, even if Napoleon never did.